It's time for me to rank all the films I've seen from the year 2006. Turns out I have seen 26 films from this particular year, so this could turn out to be a bit of a whopper. Before we get into it, a quick reminder that the top 2 films today will go through to the eventual grand final of 100 films, where I will be declaring once and for all, and with great conviction and authority, as to what the greatest film of all time is. But for now, let's concentrate on 2006. I am going to round this rankings down to a 25 film list, because that's what I've been doing all the way through this series. So there's one film today which doesn't make the cut. That film is a slasher called See No Evil. This film is just absolutely terrible. I've done a full review for this about a year ago, I think, but unless you're into the idea of ex-wrestlers playing serial killers and charging through polystyrene walls going, "Ah!" this is probably not going to be the film for you anyway. So let's get into the main rankings, and we'll start with this one at number 25. I have no idea how I came to watch this film. I don't remember watching it with a woman, so definitely one of my more random watches. The film is about a young woman played by Anne Hathaway who joins a fashion house in New York, which is run by a character played by Glenn Close, who is absolutely horrible in this film. She is the devil in the title. So Anne Hathaway has got to try and make it in the fashion industry, but it's not easy because people down at the lower end of the ladder just get treated like crap all the time. Now, I know that this goes on in the wider corporate world, but it seems particularly excessive in this film, to the point where I remember thinking, I'm glad I don't work in the fashion industry. This film left me with a bit of a bad impression of Anne Hathaway, not because she acts bad in this film, but just because I didn't enjoy the movie. And when she was cast as Catwoman many years later for Batman, my first reaction was, no, that's that woman from The Devil Wears Prada, don't pick her. But she proved me wrong, because she turned out to be an absolutely awesome Catwoman, the best ever in my opinion. But The Devil Wears Prada, totally not for me. So here we have our traditional near the bottom of the rankings slot for any animation I just happen to have seen. And I've seen this film maybe 10 times and upwards, because my oldest son went through a phase where he had this film on the TV all the time, so I ended up watching it. I feel like I've got loads of bits of dialogue from this just burned into my brain, more so than even some of the really great films that I actually like. I'm not going to give you a plot synopsis for this. It's a world where there's no human beings, just cars that can talk, go figure. It does feel a little bit like the first Fast and the Furious movie at times, especially in the scene where the Doc character is talking about the past from his garage. There's one character I really like, who's this green car, who's meant to be like the villain, but I can't remember his name. He's really funny, but on the whole, yeah, it's a film about talking cars. I'm not going to linger on it. This one brings back the memories, because it was the last time that me, my dad and my brother all went to the cinema together. My dad's passed away now, but we were very rarely all in the same place at the same time once we were in adulthood. This was a very rare occasion where we were. It was a Saturday afternoon. We went to watch this film, Snakes on a Plane. My dad was in fine form that day. He was a very jokey person. He sat in the middle in the cinema, and so with me and my brother on either side, and he kept getting his arms and pretending they were snakes during this film, and then dipping them either side and like tickling us. We were in our 20s at the time, and this was just ridiculous. We were fending him off as best we could, but it's sort of a sweet memory looking back now. It was annoying at the time. The actual film, I just didn't really like this. I was looking forward to seeing it, but I found it pretty underwhelming. The film just feels like it's over very, very quickly. Just as we're getting into it, Samuel L. Jackson flushes all the snakes out of the window and we're done. I think they should have had a bit more to this. They should have had Samuel L. Jackson like crawling through the underbelly of the plane at times, and there'd be snakes down there and stuff, but it feels like a very, very brief blink and you'll miss it horror film. It does have that famous line, doesn't it, where Samuel L. Jackson's like, "Get these motherfucking snakes off this motherfucking plane," which they didn't even think to put into the film to begin with. They added it in post-production. Yeah, I'd class it as a disappointment for me in horror terms. I've never gone back to it since that initial viewing. This is a kind of dystopian thriller about a world where women can no longer get pregnant. So obviously mankind is going to die out in the next 50, 60 years, but then a random baby is found, and it's up to Clive Owen to protect the baby from the government, who obviously want to get hold of it, and a few other nefarious groups. What I mostly remember about this, though, is that there are a few action sequences that seem to take place in just one continuous shot. It's really impressive what they do in this film. Like, there's one sequence where like a car's trying to escape a farmhouse and all these people are chasing after the car, and there doesn't seem to be any cut in the action. I was watching it thinking, how are they doing this and letting this one sequence play out for so long? And then there's another one later on where Clive Owen's going through like some abandoned buildings, and the camera doesn't seem to move from this shot for like 10-15 minutes. It's just completely seamless. So they were doing some things in this film which were very, very impressive from a technical standpoint, but the overall movie just seemed to lack a bit of heart and soul for me. The best thing about it is Michael Caine playing a hippie. Now, usually Michael Caine is the best thing about any film, whether he's playing a small part or a big part. He's got this weird thing in this where he just comes out with this phrase, pull my finger. I think it's like some kind of insult, but I don't actually get what it means. Maybe it's some kind of sexual joke, but honestly I don't get it. I've got an innocent mind. So in 2003 they made a reboot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then in 2006 they released this film, which is a prequel to the 2003 film. The trouble is, when I was watching this one I was a little bit bored because I knew exactly where the story needed to end up to get us to the beginning of the 2003 film. I knew exactly which characters were definitely not going to die. That's the trouble with prequels. Now, since I watched this film, a guy on YouTube has really tried to persuade me to give this one another shot because it's one of his favourite Texas Chainsaw films. So I have agreed to do that. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. And I think I might enjoy it next time because I am intent on doing a double bill where I watch the 2006 film first and then go straight into the 2003 film, treat it as a kind of 3-hour film on its own sort of thing. So I do have that experiment yet to come, but for now, based on my one viewing where I did not have a good time at all, this film comes very low today. A few years ago, I went on a run through the X-Men films. I found them all right, but I certainly didn't fall in love with them, and I've never gone back to them since. From what I recall, this third film was of a slightly lesser quality than the first two. I remember Vinnie Jones playing Juggernaut. He's very, very funny, and I think this is the one where Jean Grey goes bad, possibly, but on the whole, it's mainly a generic, by-the-numbers X-Men sequel. Is there any other type of X-Men sequel? This feels a little bit low for a Rocky film, but the trouble with this franchise when it comes to rankings like this is that even though the overall series is great, individually the films don't quite stack up well against other great films. At least that's the way it is for me. If I watch this series from the beginning through to the very end, it does start to feel like I'm just watching some long-running TV show kind of a thing. But this sixth film was very important for this series. I think it was a better end for Rocky's story than the fifth film. This is the only one that I've ever seen at the cinema. I saw it with a couple of mates and we had a good time. It was great to see Rocky doing another training montage and getting back in the ring and fighting Mason Dixon, even though he loses. I'm not sure off the top of my head where I would rank this film compared to all the others. I like to think that it would at least do reasonably well, come somewhere in the middle maybe. Jamaica, so that's like one of those European countries. I haven't seen this one since 2010, so my memory is probably going to be a bit hazy when I'm discussing it. The reason why I can remember the specific year is because I watched it about 3 days after I got married. So the film is sort of a film of two halves, if you like. In the first half, we follow these villagers as they're captured by this nasty tribe and taken on this expedition to some kind of stone temple where they're all going to be sacrificed because of some god or something. It's pretty nasty stuff. And then in the second half of the film, this one guy manages to escape from the temple and he runs back towards his village, but there's like 7 or 8 warriors chasing after him. It's the second half of the film I had a slight problem with this because some of the ways that the main character evades the warriors, it just feels a little bit contrived. Even the way he escapes from the stone temple in the first place is a little bit contrived for me. The ending doesn't really have much of a punch. There's no great villain in this. I still enjoyed it from what I can remember. I thought it was all right. I certainly thought it was an original film, not like anything I've really ever seen before, but I just feel like it could have been better. This is an interesting film to look back on now because it's the only one I've seen that's got Amber Heard in it. Well, she's in Justice League, but for about one scene, I think. In All the Boys Love Mandy Lane, she's the starring part. She plays Mandy Lane herself. Mandy is basically a character who all the boys in high school really, really fancy, but Mandy has not really decided who she wants to date. She's taking her time when it comes to the dating scene. And in the meantime, people are getting killed left, right and centre because this is a slasher film, essentially, with a slight trace of giallo to it. There's a very, very big twist towards the end, which I'm not going to spoil. I've always kind of wanted to go back and watch the film a second time. Now that I know the twist, I think that would be quite interesting, but I've just not gotten around to it yet. So depending on whether you have a problem with Amber Heard or not, this might be an enjoyable film for you. Personally, I don't really care that much about celebrity news or celebrity trials. I'm kind of indifferent to all that. I neither like nor dislike Amber Heard as a person, so I'd be quite happy to go back and watch this film again. I'm amazed that this one has come this high today because I don't normally like romantic comedies. I watched this one a couple of years ago at Christmas with my wife, and to my amazement, I wasn't bored throughout it. I'm not going to explain the plot because it's kind of a complicated one. Essentially, you've got four characters played by Jude Law, Kate Winslet, Jack Black, and Cameron Diaz. I can't believe I left her till last. They've got intertwining lives, and by the end of the film, they end up a couple of couples, if you see what I mean. But I really liked the characters in this. Now, normally, I don't like the characters in romantic comedies. If you normally show me people like Kate Winslet and Cameron Diaz on dates, I normally think, why should I care about this? Because you're the sort of person who can just spin the wheel tomorrow and have another 1,000 blokes come across and ask you out. So why should I feel invested in this storyline? That's how I normally feel about romantic comedies. But with this one, I just found myself liking the characters from a very early stage. There's also a small role for Eli Wallace, who you might remember from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, if you've ever seen that film. In this, he's now an actor about 90. He strikes up a friendship with Kate Winslet in this film, and it's really, really cute. I think Eli Wallace has died in real life now, but back when this film came out, 2006, he was still alive and he was still doing a little bit of acting. He looks very old in this, but it's kind of cool that he's got a little part. So yeah, I don't like many romantic comedies, it's got to be said, but if I was ever going to do a top 10 of them, this would definitely be in the top 10. Time with a Martin Scorsese gangster film is never wasted. I probably like this one more than I do Goodfellas. I've never been massive on Goodfellas. This one's got a really clever plot. So there's this cop who is working as a mole in this local criminal organisation, but there's also somebody from the criminal organisation working as a mole in the police force. And these two characters are completely unaware of each other's existence. So they're both doing the same thing, but in reverse. The film is captivating all the way through, and the final half an hour or so, there's tons of twists and unexpected developments that you just don't see coming. So I really like this film. I'm not really into the gangster genre usually, but there's the occasional film like this that I do enjoy. Carlito's Way probably being the best of all of them, but The Departed is also really, really strong. This film had no right to be as good as it turned out to be. I mean, the Fast and the Furious franchise was on its deathbed by the time the third film came out. There was no Paul Walker, no Vin Diesel. If you were a betting man, you would have said that this was probably going to be the final one. And yet, it turned out to be, if not one of the best films in the franchise, then certainly one which I think stands up very well compared to all the others. I did a Fast and the Furious ranking a few months ago, and I can't remember where I put this one, but I think it was either halfway up or maybe just slightly below halfway, but there are definitely Fast and the Furious films worse than this. It takes place in Japan, and Japan looks absolutely stunning in this film. I don't know if they filmed the whole thing actually in Japan, but every single scene just looks absolutely gorgeous and full of colour, especially if you watch it in HD. The actual car racing in this film looks great as well. This whole drift technique thing that they go for, I found to be really fun. Lucas Black is no Paul Walker or Vin Diesel, but he does all right. And the main girl in this, I thought she was very, very impressive, and I'm a little bit sad that she didn't quite go on to have a really great Hollywood career. I've seen this film 2 or 3 times, and I've always enjoyed it. For me, the best of the Final Destination films, albeit only by a horse's hair. It feels a little bit harsh that I'm not putting the best film in a franchise even in the top 10 of the year that it came out. But that's life. This one is definitely boosted by the fact that Mary Elizabeth Winstead is in the lead role, and I love the opening to this on the roller coaster. I mean, personally, I am absolutely terrified of roller coasters. You will not get me on one if I'm in a theme park. I just will not go there. Funnily enough, I used to go out with this girl, and if I was watching a horror film at home, she would not watch a horror film. She couldn't even bear to look at the screen. She was absolutely terrified of horror films. She'd literally just wouldn't look at the screen. I don't get that because, personally, what's on a screen cannot hurt you. Okay, that's the way my brain thinks about it. Now, we went to a fairground once, me and this girl, and obviously I couldn't go on any of these massive rides, just absolutely cannot do it, because the logic in my brain says that these things can hurt you. You know, something goes wrong with them mechanically, you might die potentially. So for me, not interested. But this girl, she could go on anything. She was going on all the biggest, most wildest, crazy, spinny around rides. I was like, how can you not be afraid of that? And yet, when we're at home, you are petrified of watching a horror film. It makes absolutely no sense to me, but there you are. So the start of Final Destination 3, very effective from my point of view. And the rest of the film has the usual assortment of interestingly staged kills. And with this one, you even get a really cool ending on a train as well. So yeah, definitely, just by a smidgen, I would say this is the best Final Destination film, marginally ahead of the fourth film. So this is the third film in a row now that has been the third film in a franchise. So we had Fast and the Furious 3, Final Destination 3, and now Saw 3. That wasn't intended, but sometimes when you do a rankings like this, you get these weird little coincidences that come out. Saw 3 is a good film. It's also the point, I think, where the franchise just started to enter its very slow decline, because for me, Saw 2 is the absolute best. And even though Saw 3 is sort of close to the standard of Saw 2, we have just about gone over the top of the mountain at this point, and then we're onto the slope of decline, if you like. This is definitely a step up in gore from the first two Saw films. I mean, this film is absolutely brutal in terms of how gruesome it is. That first scene where Donnie Wahlberg is whacking his leg off with that toilet seat or whatever it is. I watched this film in the cinema, and everybody in the cinema was like, oh, every time he was whacking his leg. It was like everybody in there was just being slapped across the face several times. And the film doesn't let up after that. There's so many nasty things you've got to sit through, like the guy who has to pull rings out of his nipples and his and other parts of his body, and that what's that trap called, the rack, where the guy's head's spinning around and his wrists are snapping, and there's a point where Jigsaw has to do brain surgery. It's a nasty film from a gore point of view, but the story is very good, and it wraps up what I think should have remained a trilogy. You know, this was a very, very natural trilogy. Once they got to the fourth film and just started dragging it out for the sake of it, that's where the series did lose a little bit of credibility, even though some of those later sequels are still very watchable and enjoyable. From a story point of view, it should have been just 3 films, but when it comes to the overall ranking of the Saw movies, there are 9 of them in total. I would probably put this one third. I did actually do a Saw rankings video many, many months ago, and I think I put this one third. It would have been third or fourth. I didn't like this film when I first watched it, and I watched Man of Steel a couple of weeks later, and I found that to be a really exciting, instantly accessible film, whereas Superman Returns was just a little bit odd, and I definitely wouldn't have any need to go back to that one again. But I did go back to it, and I enjoyed it much more the second time around, and then I saw it a third time, and suddenly it was a film that I really, really liked. It is the absolute definition, this film, of a grower, something which does get better the more you absorb it, the more you take it in. I'm not sure how it's supposed to fit into the continuity of the Christopher Reeve films. I think some of those films count towards this and some of them don't, but it's odd that they would be connected to those films at all, because in the early Superman films, you've got this Lois Lane, played by Margot Kidder, who's clearly like 40 plus or something, and then you get to this film where we've got a Lois Lane who's surely in her 20s. It doesn't make any sense. But I really like the Superman you get in this. He's played by Brendan Ruth, I'm not sure. But he went on to be in the Legends of Tomorrow TV show, and he's absolutely brilliant in that show. Really, really funny actor. And I like the Lois Lane in this. I can't remember the actress's name. It's not going to come to me, but I think she does a damn good portrayal of Lois Lane. It's a shame that we've got Kevin Spacey in the film playing Lex Luthor, but the overall film strikes almost the perfect tone, I think, between the slightly camp and comedic and the more serious stuff. So yeah, this film for me proves that a superhero film doesn't necessarily need to go on to have 7 sequels and be part of a shared universe. It can just be a great one-off thing, which is absolutely what this is. So time for day 2 of filming this video, and into the top 10 we go with yet another third film in a franchise. 2006 really was the year of the attempted trilogy closer, seemingly. This isn't one of the better Mission Impossible films. It does this really irritating thing at the start that you usually see a lot more in TV. So basically what they'll do is they'll show you a really pivotal moment of the action from later in the story, and then we'll flash back to like sometime in the past, and then we'll spend the rest of the show or the film building up to that moment we've already seen. I don't like this form of storytelling. I think I've talked about this on the channel before. It is more common in TV. Me and my wife watch a lot more TV together than we do film, and every time we watch an episode of something and this technique is used, we immediately look to each other and as if to say, oh, not this shit again. I at least get the logic of why it would be in a TV show. You know, they want to make sure that people are gripped right from the first few seconds and they don't switch channels maybe, but for cinema, I mean, once you've paid your cinema ticket, that's it. You're not going to walk out after 5 minutes just because you're not instantly gripped. So, bit disappointing that we see that thing done in Mission Impossible 3, but once you get past that, the rest of the film is your typically enjoyable Mission Impossible fare. This one's not quite as bombastic as some of the later ones to come, 4, 5, 6, but still a lot of fun. I don't think Philip Seymour Hoffman is the legendary Mission Impossible villain that some people make him out to be, but the fact that this has still made the top 10, even though I consider it to be one of the weaker films in this franchise, whereas the best Final Destination film for me didn't even make the top 10, probably shows you that I like this franchise a lot more than some of the other ones we've already gone past today. This is a remake of The Hills Have Eyes. I don't think it's quite as good as the original Wes Craven classic, but it's probably better than Wes Craven's sequel he did in the early 80s. What I like about this one is the fact that it expands on the original story a little bit, and it introduces that test site place that looks like somewhere the Americans might test bombs and things. It's a bit similar to that place that Indiana Jones finds in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. There hasn't been a Hills Have Eyes movie for quite a long time now, and what I think they should do with it is maybe make a TV show. They could start out by making the cannibals the big threat, and then they could have some kind of Area 51 type place that the protagonists discover. There could end up being some villain from within the main group of caravanners who turns bad over time. I think there's potential there for some kind of limited series, but this first film of the remake films is probably the only other really good one after the original one by Craven. This is a film about the Battle of Hiroshima during World War II. So if you don't know what that is, basically the Japanese had this massive island which was of huge strategic importance to both themselves and the Americans. So ultimately the Americans decided to assault it, the Japanese trying to defend it, and it led to this massive conflict with lots of casualties, lots of large-scale battles. This film depicts what happened during that conflict. It's directed by Clint Eastwood, not a man with a massive amount of directorial flair in my opinion, but he does know how to tell a very engaging, straightforward, easy-to-understand story. This film's from the point of view of the Japanese. Now, if you're wondering why Eastwood didn't set it from the point of view of the Americans, that's because he'd already done a film like that. Yeah, he did 2 films about this exact same conflict. Both of them came out in the same year. Now, what was the name of the other film that was from the point of view of the Americans? And so here we have that other film about the exact same conflict, and here are both films on Blu-ray. The only reason why I've put Flags of Our Fathers just slightly ahead is because culturally, I think I feel much closer to being an American than I do a Japanese man. I much better understand the American sense of camaraderie than I do what's going on with the Japanese. It's easier for me to picture myself being in the American army, but when I'm watching Letters from Hiroshima, I'm still wanting the Japanese to win when I'm watching that film. This is an extremely well put together project. Full credit to Clint Eastwood for doing this. It's not often you see something like this where you get to witness two sides of the same coin, of the same set of circumstances. You should focus less on which film I've put ahead of the other and more on the fact that both films are side by side in this ranking. I think it's really cool that both films are of an equal quality. I don't think you could binge them on the same night, by the way. They're sort of getting on towards the 2.5 hour mark, both of them. But if you watch them, say, one night after the other, I think you'll have a great experience with this. I like both the novels and the movie series of this, although I didn't read the most recent Robert Langdon book, the fifth one. I can't keep up to date with everything that I'd like to keep up to date with. But speaking strictly about this one, The Da Vinci Code, it's an excellent movie based upon an excellent book. It's less an action thriller and more a really kind of thought-provoking, complex puzzle of a movie, if you like, with lots of stuff to do with religion in it. It did cause a bit of controversy when it came out because people said, oh, you're just rewriting history, you're trying to mess around with people's religious beliefs and stuff. But in my opinion, we can still have fictionalized religion, and that's got nothing to do with the real religion on the outside of the fiction, if you see what I mean. So not criticism that's justified in my opinion. Tom Hanks is superb in this movie. It's such a clever plot. It really is. I won't spoil any of it, but moving through it and seeing how it all unravels and how it builds towards the climax, whether you're reading the novel of it or watching the film, you'll have a really good time. I really like this. This is probably the most controversial placing on this list, at least for people who have seen this film. If you haven't, then what I've just said will just go over your head. But this is the third film in the I Know What You Did Last Summer trilogy. In this one, the fisherman becomes a supernatural killer, whereas in the first two films, he was a flesh and blood killer. I think that's part of the reason why people don't like this one. Also, it had a much lower budget. None of the original cast were back for this one, so that there was no longer any Jennifer Love Hewitt. I really like it, though. The only reason I watched it is because when I bought this box set of the trilogy, the third film was included, obviously. So I stuck it on thinking I might as well at least try it. I've heard it's crap, but to my surprise, I actually really enjoyed it. I think it's a pretty decent slasher. It doesn't bother me the fact that the killer's gone supernatural. That happens anyway halfway through the Friday the 13th films. It happens in other horror franchises and people don't mind. And I think this film's directed quite well. It's got a sense of style to it. I think the characters are very likeable. And I don't get why the rest of the planet hates this movie. People really do beat on it, but I am one of its very, very few fans, and I'm quite happy to have it in my top 5 today. So this is the second Pirates film. It feels like it should be the third one, given our theme today. Incidentally, I didn't make note just now, did I, of the fact that I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer is yet another third film in a franchise. But going back to Pirates 2, I think this one does a very good job of expanding on the original. It does a lot of good world building. It's a very colourful film. It does a very good job of having lots of different intertwining stories going on in different locations. I think it's got a great villain in Davy Jones. I love all the stuff to do with the Kraken. I think that stuff is fantastic. Its only fault, really, is that it doesn't really have an ending. The first film is this nice, complete, satisfying story that could have been the end of the whole thing right then and there. This one, though, it has that same problem that a lot of second films in a trilogy have, especially when they're planned to be a trilogy, where you get to the end of the second one and it's kind of like, okay, here's a cliffhanger, see you next year for part 3, The Empire Strikes Back, exactly the same situation. Before the ending, though, everything leading up to that point is highly enjoyable. I don't actually know what the overall consensus is on Pirates 2. My memory of other people talking about these films is that people love the first one, but usually hate on all of the sequels. I like all 5, though. This is a real family favourite franchise in my family. Me and my wife went to watch the 4th one and the 5th one at the cinema, and I would absolutely love it if Johnny Depp came back and did a 6th one, but I highly doubt that will happen. But Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, fantastic film. A little bit, this is another negative I might just have, it gets a little bit unrealistic with the action at times, like when you see the three-way fight on the wheel that's spinning around the field. It gets a little bit silly at that point, and there's a couple of moments like when Jack's on this like kebab stick thing hanging off a cliff. It gets a little bit over the top to the point where you can't even believe in the movie anymore. But I still really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of great humour. Really, really colourful film. I like Pirates of the Caribbean, if it's not obvious. So here we have today's unlucky film, which doesn't quite make it to the grand final, but don't feel too sorry for Kate Beckinsale, because I have already put the original Underworld through to the final when I did my 2003 ranking. This is an excellent sequel for me, just maybe slightly down on the first one, but it's got lots of great action. Watching Celine and her, I forget the name of her partner in crime who she rolls with in these films, watching those two, trying to stay one step ahead of whoever the big bad was in this. I can't remember actually, but it's been a while since I saw it, but I can see fragments of the film sort of in my head, various action sequences and things. It is a good ride, but it's not quite going through to the final. But when it comes to these Underworld films, it's sort of similar for me to the Pirates of the Caribbean films. You go on the internet and look at reviews for them, they get slagged off left, right and centre, but I really enjoy them, pretty much all of them as well. But let's move on and find out what we've got in the top two. Let's find out what's going through to the grand final, and we'll start with this film at number 2. Slightly strange this, because I wouldn't even call Casino Royale my favourite of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and yet here it is at number 2, seemingly going through to the grand final. I do think it's benefited from, well, I wouldn't call 2006 a weak year, but it's a year where there aren't really that many knockout masterpiece films. There's lots of films that I really enjoy, but there's only really one film that I think is absolutely amazing. We'll come to that film in just a moment. At least Casino Royale is a really strong film, though. It's based on Fleming's very first novel, I believe, the only James Bond novel that I've ever read. Now, unlike The Da Vinci Code, where the novel and the movie are both really amazing, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the Casino Royale novel if you've not read it, because it's a very bare bones novel. It's very of its time. It's a very old feeling sort of story. It's nothing like the 2006 movie version. It's weird to look back on Casino Royale, though, in the context of my life, because when I watched this at the cinema, I was 26. I saw it with a housemate. Fast forward to the end of the Craig era with No Time to Die in 2021 as it would have been when it came out. I watched that one at the cinema with my wife, an 11-year-old son. He wasn't even born when Casino Royale came out. It's so weird. I don't think we'll ever see another era as grand in scale as Daniel Craig's again, in all honesty. Right, Casino Royale is number 2, probably going through to the grand final, numbers permitting, but it's now time to see which film came number 1 for 2006. Yep, Silent Hill, baby. I absolutely love this film. I usually watch it at least once a year. I was a fan of the video games when they were around, like at the start of the noughties, so that probably contributed to the fact that when Silent Hill came on at the cinema, I did instantly love it as much as I did. Yeah, this is another film I saw at the cinema in 2006. It's just a fantastic film. So to give you an idea of the story, there's this girl who's having visions of an old deserted ghost town called Silent Hill. Her mother, being really concerned about the girl's behaviour and sleepwalking, decides to take the girl to this town to see if they can figure out what's going on. But when they get there, they end up trapped in this other dimension, and there's like hellish creatures and stuff, and there's a fanatical cult of humans who are trapped in this dimension. It's very much a weird fantasy horror, but it's brilliantly directed by this guy called Christoph Gans. Sean Bean's in the film. The main woman's played by Radha Mitchell, and Laurie Holden's in it as well. Some really great performances, interesting characters. I love the design of the creatures, great music. I could go on and on and on. I have actually done a full review for this, so if you want to hear my full thoughts on it, then check it out. But for me, this is one of the most underrated horror films ever made. It's absolutely wonderful, and it is my number 1 for 2006. Right, just before I go, I'll quickly share with you some films that I didn't include on today's ranking because I've not seen, and yet I sort of would like to if I get the time at some point. So one of those films is Crank by Jason Statham. The Grudge 2 with Sarah Michelle Gellar. I've seen the first one, but not the second one. The Prestige, which as far as I'm aware, is a very good Christopher Nolan film. One of the few of his that I've not yet checked out. And a film called Hatchet. In fact, I've not seen any of the Hatchet movies. I've not seen any of the 4 of them. At some point, I'm going to have to get on that. Right, that is the end of my 2006 rankings. We have Silent Hill and Casino Royale going through to the grand final. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.